throw my email address around a lot today.
Okay.
And I will get you.
And I have it too, and
I just didn't get the official thing done.
I don't know.
Is it?
Great. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Haley Wilmer, joining us today from the U.S. Research Sheep Station in Du Bois, Idaho. And she is a social rangeland scientist who looks at the cultural, political, and ecological dimension shaping rangeland science. And going to share a little bit about the history, it sounds like, and some of the kind of current projects she's been working on there. And as she mentioned, there are opportunities to get involved, probably also some volunteer opportunities or job opportunities as well. And I know some students, we went and worked with Haley last year.
Last fall.
This time last fall. But there'll probably be hopefully some more opportunities down the road too. So might see more of this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Well, I'm really excited to be here. I love UM Western, and any chance to come up to Dillon is fun. So I'm excited just to connect with you all. I'm going to pitch some ideas. They're not new. If you've been, around the range or ranching world for a while, these aren't my ideas. There's a lot of really fantastic grandmothers and grandfathers that have written and thought and worked with the animals. And so I tried to put it together in a framework to show you kind of how I'm thinking about my job at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station. So I'll explain a little bit about what I do. I work at the Agriculture Research Service, which is the research branch of the USDA. And so we are, Ben's in the back, we are your scientists. And we have different locations around the country that deal with the sustainability and production of whatever that local agriculture system is. So if you go to Eastern Colorado, there's a dryland beet lab. If you travel to Miles City, there's a range and livestock cattle facility. There's hydrology in Boise. There are folks in Las Cruces, New Mexico, looking at rangelands there. So you'll probably see ARS pop up as you drive through the middle of nowhere, and that's kind of what we're good at. And we're very long-term, very patient researchers, and my job is just to do science. I publish 2 papers a year at least, and try to do more, and try to think about these systems in some different contexts related to sustainability and food and fiber production. The U.S. Sheep Experiment Station is not just interested in sheep. We think about rangeland sustainability and wildlife habitat because we're in a mixed use, multi-use system. And we were really set up in 1916 to kind of work with the systems that were in place then in this region. And the beaverhead was a huge part of that. So, we're just over the hill, feels like a long ways away, totally different side of the continental divide, but it's always traditionally been connected to this community as well. So the way that what I'm going to try to do today is pin some ideas and some vocabulary and some methods up on the bulletin board of this room, sort of conceptually. And I want to get some feedback from you all about what I'm saying, if it's making sense, what challenges you see, what kind of role a school like this might have in working on some of these problems. I went into this work because I grew up just down the road in Livingston, and I saw ranchers and conservationists in my community arguing over wolf reintroduction and the role of livestock, the role of wildlife in my community. I was in ag classes and I was in biology classes, and I was just surrounded by all these different viewpoints. And really early on, I thought, boy, there's not one answer to this. All of these folks know a lot about this system. And so I'm really happy to be back here, being able to work in this system and to think about kind of a home landscape, even though I'm a little bit removed from Yellowstone area. I'm going to talk about transhumant or transhumant livestock production systems. Is that a word anybody's heard or used before? Transhumants? Okay, so vocab word. If you learn one thing today, I'll talk about the Intermountain sheep systems and how they bring us to some core questions about sustainable agro-ecosystems. And I use that term just to mean that when we produce food and fiber, we are in an ecosystem. We are in a social and ecological system. And so we can all hyphenate everything, but that's the word that I'm using this time. I'll talk about my station and sort of the role that we've played and what we can kind of show about the changes that are going on, and my lab within the station, which is the Rangeland Collaboratory, and how I'm working with some different models to bring different voices together in my science, and then kind of pitch my next steps. But before I get started, I just wanted to pin up here that 2026 has been designated by the UN as the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. This is a pretty phenomenal recognition of a way of life that's generally pretty marginalized and under-recognized. And there's a classic joke in range science that we start every talk with. Did you know 50% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is covered in rangelands, but nobody knows what they are? Well, it's almost 1 billion people that directly rely on these lands for their livelihoods, 600 million households, and in many places where women cannot own land and have trouble accessing property rights, they can own livestock. So these systems are very old. It's one of the oldest things we do. Very new to the Americas, and that's part of the problem. But check out this website. There's some really awesome videos about rangeland production systems all over the world. And if you're in Southwest Montana, you're going to recognize some of these patterns. Some of these the hats are just great, So there's just all kinds of things to think about here. I really want to go see these cows and sisters. Okay.
Where is that?
This is I think these are Swiss cows.
Swiss or
Yeah.
Southeast Germany or Southwest Germany?
These are Alps, in the Alps, yeah. And it just speaks to how much they mean to the people in the culture, right? Yeah. I mean, that makes the purple ribbon look silly, right? So transhuman systems, what do I mean by that? And this is a map of the Intermountain West, and these lines, if you zoom in, these lines are movement of sheep across the region prior to about 1935, 1936. This is from a report from the early 40s. And you've all heard of the big cattle drives, moving cattle to market. Transhuman systems are a form of pastoralism where it's a seasonal movement up and down the elevation gradient, back and forth. So it's not just a one way, it's a two-way seasonal pattern. And they've been recognized all over the world. They're very old in Europe, in West Asia, and in the Asian steppes. They're fairly new to the Intermountain area, but I'll talk a little bit more about how we're recognizing them here and how in all of these systems they face similar challenges in terms of, if you think about you drive out through the Beaverhead this time of year, what do you see? You see cattle trucks coming, right? And these animals are moving off to where? Where are calves going right now?
Off the range into feed.
Into feed, yep. Some of them are being fed in Montana. Beaverhead County is like the nursery of Black Angus. So they're born here. We could start at the beginning. They're born here in the spring. They move. They're probably fed for a while, and then they go out into the range, up into the uplands, maybe up into the montane, maybe onto a Forest Service permit or a BLM permit. And then they come back down in the fall. Then they might get fed, and then they get weaned. And if they're a 600-700 pound calf, that's pretty big, but they're weaned, and they might go to a feed yard here. They might go all the way to Nebraska, and then they're ready for slaughter. Most animals follow that system. That's true here. That's true in the Bay Area. The most common land use in the Bay Area of San Francisco is cattle. It's a big system that we don't necessarily think about. It's more integrated globally, but it happens at different scales. Transhumance is being recognized more and more because as livestock systems lose mobility and become more confined, we're recognizing that we're losing other benefits or other outcomes of that system, and it's changing. So there's been more research in rangeland ecology and in anthropology to understand these systems and how they impact ecological and social processes. So PF Star says transhumance employs livestock driveways to move domesticated animals in an efficient seasonal use of geographically distinct ecological zones. You're following the grain up the hill and back down. Transhumance is the new black, a really cool chapter in a new book that's out on transhuman production systems in Europe. My academic advisor, Maria Fernandez Jimenez, has spent her life studying pastoral peoples and how they're transforming and transitioning in a global economy. She has a great blog about her sabbatical in Spain and some cool poems you can read about a 30-day transhuman path that they still follow there. How do you find somebody in your family that wants to go for a walk for 30 days with cows and sheep, you know? What does that really mean, and what does it mean to be out there? And then Lynn Hunsinger is a professor at Berkeley. Lynn's been recognized for her contribution to range science in connecting these ideas about pastoralism globally to what's happening with ranching in the Western US. And that's really important for us to have those ways of thinking with each other about the problems that ranchers and pastoralists face, because there are some similarities across the globe. And Letizia Bindi says transhumance constitutes an important social relationship with nature via mobile livestock livelihoods adapted to rugged range landscapes. It's a system of livestock breeding, husbandry, and grazing management involving semi-annual stock movement among biomes or ecosystems, typically over an elevation gradient. Across the world, these systems still sustain rural economies and lifeways. They shape language, culture, kinship networks, relationship to place, and land management ethics. As an alternative to more intensified or consolidated forms of agriculture, these systems can support highly localized food systems, artisanal products, and a system of land management and local knowledge. And in Europe, where transhuman systems have lost their mobility, they're actually observing changes in vegetation that don't match what people think the rural countryside should look like. So they're actually subsidizing the rejuvenation of these processes to manage shrub encroachment, basically, which is also a problem that we have here. So here's what this looks like in California. This is a diagram from one of Lynn Hunsinger's papers that shows how livestock move from the Sacramento Valley to the foothills to the Sierra Nevada to the eastern slope, across private land and national forest and Bureau of Land Management land over the course of the year. So you guys kind of familiar with this? Have you seen this in public lands grazing around here? Yeah. So there's winter range, there's summer range. The thing about this production system is that a core part of the land that makes up the forage in this system is shared with other uses. So recreationists, wildlife interests, energy, oil and gas development, hunting, many different uses for our public lands are also shared with agriculture. It's a little bit different if you go down to a pure small grain farmer. You know, there's certainly outcomes of that for water quality and air quality, but we sort of assume a farm is for farming. Rangelands, not so much. It's not that everyone is in agreement on what's happening there. And I'm reminded of this every time I say I'm from the sheep station, because somebody has something to say about sheep right away. Right away. Yep. So it's humbling for all of us. So in the Intermountain systems, I think it's just to point out how what's going on here, or what traditionally happened in this region with sheep. Sheep production and livestock production are hundreds of years old in North America, but a lot of what's happening here took place sort of after the Taylor Grazing Act, so after the Dust Bowl, or during the Dust Bowl, and then was really shaped by environmental policies throughout the 20th century. So some of these patterns are still there, and some have changed quite a bit because of environmental regulation. The sheep industry has in the last generation, has experienced massive declines across the West in terms of sheep numbers and also access to public lands grazing, predominantly following the end of the direct wool subsidy in the 1990s. Greasy wool production had just declined rapidly after 1995. We still have a few very large range producers and a lot of very small flocks. And actually, it's pretty exciting. The number of small flocks is going up. And so we have a really diverse group of producers. We have a lot of women, we have a lot of people of color, we have a lot of small, really diverse flocks that have a lot of different genetics and a lot of different modes of production, unlike sort of the almost monolithic Black Angus story in cattle. So we're a little bit more dynamic. We have traditionally and continue to struggle with views of grazing and also environmental impacts, particularly to biodiversity. And so even though a lot of the stories, maybe people aren't eating lamb anymore, people are eating lamb. We actually import about 40% of the lamb that gets eaten here. So that tells you we don't produce enough, or we don't produce enough at the time of year that people want to eat it, to have it on the shelf all the time. It's a little bit more of a complicated story as to why we've seen the decline in sheep numbers. And just to hit the point home, early on there really were some really violent conflicts over sheep access to public lands. It's a very real thing, and it went on into the 1920s. But today it's even more complicated because these other land uses, biodiversity conservation, are imperative, and ranchers are trying to work with conservationists to find collaborative coexistence solutions or to Tetris goals in a way where sort of all the interests have a say and potentially some input into how land is used and no one is excluded. So what does that look like? And that's hit home for us at the sheep station over and over again. And here's just a picture of what kind of a conceptual diagram of the mobility of sheep across the range in the historic days. I would love to use this as baseline data to look at what's happening now and how it's happening. They've done it in California to kind of piece that story together. And, it's just kind of a neat century of change that we've experienced. Does anybody have thoughts on that before? Yeah.
Can you explain that map of where they moved a little bit?
Yeah, so this is showing sort of like core regions that sheep would move out of and back into throughout the year. So there's kind of like key localized regions, like East Idaho would be kind of like a key area. They move down into the desert and up into the mountains and back down. And there's probably different cultures and different family dynamics and different power structures in all those different parts of the world. And certainly different types of problems and ecological stories. But it's just to kind of conceptualize how much livestock move across the country in kind of a regional area.
So how big is that map?
So here's this is mostly everything west of Wyoming, okay, all the way over to California. Okay. Yeah. Here's Utah. Here's Idaho. Yeah. Oh, it's moving for me. So the sheep station is like I was mentioning, is just south of Dillon and Dubois, and we have a number of properties. We have a headquarters area here, which kind of stands in for what a lot of producers would have as their spring and fall grazing on BLM land. It's not BLM land, it's ours. And then we would traditionally move up into these foothills properties and then up into our summer range, which is actually in Montana in the Centennial Mountains. Has anybody been up to the Centennials? Okay, so just north of the Idaho border are our traditional montane pastures, or 16,000 acres up there that are managed as wilderness that we traditionally grazed on for July and August. So that gives you a feel for where we're at. We've done a lot of long-term research, either on the ecological side or predominantly on the sheep genetics and nutrition side to promote and support the sheep industry across the region. But the other fun thing about the station, and if anybody's interested in that body of work, I could send you, the papers of what we've sort of done over the years. But the other interesting thing for me is that we've operated like a large-scale commercial ranch, but all the records are there. I don't have to go interview somebody and take their word for it that there are this many sheep. I've got access to all that data. So it's a really fun example of how the system has changed over time. Because a lot of the things that have happened here happened out in the real world. So, one of the ways that I'm working with that story is by creating ecological calendars. Ecological calendars are a qualitative method that maps the decisions in a production system or a hunting system or a gathering system over the course of the year. So you can see what happens, what the humans do in relation to what the animals are doing and what the plants and the climate are doing. And then you can think about that as a kind of what they call a boundary object. You're putting it on paper, laying it out on the table so you can talk about it. And you can say, oh, in drought years, what do? It moves everything around. Or if we have a really wet year, what does it do? It moves everything around. Or if we anticipate in 50 years to have a warmer, drier climate, how are we going to adjust this production cycle? Because when you come to a rancher and you say, look, climate change is coming, you're going to need to do X, Y, Z. They think, oh my gosh, all the things I would have to do to change that, right? And so this kind of accounts for that. And we use local knowledge and local awareness of the system to build these. So they're contextual. They speak to a place, they speak to people, and they speak a language that scientists and managers can work on together. And actually, these exist in many high elevation and high latitude cultures all over the world, actually. Sometimes they're oral, sometimes they're very old and they're written down. So we can actually compare how they've changed over time. So I constructed 2 ecological calendars for the sheep station, and I focused them on the work of 2 of our operations managers. I just kind of broke it up into time periods based on these 2 gentlemen to cover my lifetime of change. So Quinn Jacobson, who's here, taking me on a tour of the summer range, was there from 86 to 2009 and kept really detailed records of how he made decisions. His job was not science, it was to find forage for sheep and keep everything alive and run the place and hire folks. Mark Williams, who came from Seed and Land and Livestock outside of Cascade, actually started at the station in 86 as a tech and then worked into the manager job in 2009. In between, sometime it's a little fuzzy because it wasn't like one point in time, but in between these 2 gentlemen, something really big happened for the station, which is that for various reasons, we stopped grazing our winter range and we stopped grazing our summer range. So we went from a system under Quinn where we were on BLM land, then moved across up into the high elevation pastures and back down, to a system under Mark where we didn't have access to range from January, February, and we didn't have access to range in July and August. So what I wanted to do with these calendars is see what the managers did. How did they adjust? Where did the feed come from? What did life at the station look like under these 2 situations? So it's a little generalized because little parts went away at different times, and
Did your numbers stay the same?
the numbers, we strove to keep the numbers the same. It's a little tricky because sometimes research would bump the numbers up, not for reasons. But we are generally lower, and I don't have the exact records because the person with the records is on maternity leave right now, but we're a little lower than we were under Quinn. It's hard to tell if that's because of the research or because of the range. So I've got to parse that out. But generally they try to keep it at around 3,000 head. Because any lower than that, we're not really operating, at the scale that we need to. So what is the transformation in the system with the loss of ranges? Our winter ranges are right here. They're not on this map because they're BLM and Forest Service, but they're right along the Lemhi across the foothills of the central Idaho mountains. Okay, so in this context, what are we dealing with? Bighorn sheep habitat, sage-grouse habitat, grizzly habitat, black bears, gray wolves, wolverines potentially, Arctic grayling, what else? Coyotes, eagles, ravens.
No, fox.
Fox, yep. Lots of elk, lots of deer, lots of cattle, lots of recreation. Hunters, ATVs, wilderness interests, changing climate, changing fire regimes, shrub encroachment, warmer summers, drier summers. Whoa. Okay. So if anyone can draw and wants to draw this for me. So here's what it looked like early on. They'd start in the desert steppe. They'd move up through the mountain big stage to the foothills and come back down. They had to wean out of the summer range. They would breed in November, October, and then they come back to winter range. So here's where blizzards could be a really big deal because they're out on the range. Here's where drought could be a really big deal because they're on the south side of the Centennials. Here's where shearing in May, wet sheep in May, that sounds like a rough thing for shearing, right? There's a lot going on. They're trailing by foot across the big desert down there in Idaho. And if you drove down there sometime in January, you know, if you're on your way to trucker hunting, you might have seen them. They had to get permission. They had to check that nobody else was moving a band of sheep across at the same time, you know, and dealing with motorists and all those kinds of things. So a pretty complicated system in general, and I could talk more about sort of the daily life of that. But some key things were that, I don't know if I mentioned this, but there's always a herder with sheep. There's always a herder with sheep. And on public lands, allotments, there's always a herder with sheep. It's required. So sheep are a very labor-intensive system. Lambing is a very labor-intensive time of year. That's why we're recruiting today with you guys. So when you're up in a wilderness setting and you've got a herder up there by themselves, they need information. They need food and water, and they need someone to move their camp. And so we also have a whole cadre of support staff, we call them the camp tenders, who had to know how to get around by themselves on horseback in the woods with barely any radio, you know. And then maybe the herder would quit halfway through the summer, and then they're up there. And I made the mistake when we were traveling through with Quinn of saying, okay, to the younger staff, can you start to imagine what it'd be like to herd up here in the summer? What would it be like if we ever came back here? Would you know how to do it? And Boyd Leonard, our camp tender, who's 60 years old, looked at me and he said, don't you assume that you know what it's like. Don't you assume, because there's bears and you can't see your sheep and you're up all night and it is the most stressful 2 weeks, you know, just to be out here by yourself. So there's a lot of local knowledge of getting around and dealing with sheep at 9,400 feet. Just being at 9,400 feet burns my neck, you know, I like my eyes are burning just being up there. So there's a lot to this system. Of course, there's a lot we don't know. Under the time period that Mark, what he had to deal with was not having access to the desert steppes, so I've X'd it off, not having access to the summer range. And so where do sheep go? They're in the feedlot from November to March, which means we're securing and mixing rations. We're buying feed from somewhere else. That comes in from somewhere else. Or they're on crop stubble in the fall. So we're leasing pasture from farmers who have alfalfa stubble. That brings up a whole bunch of issues with feet, things we've never dealt with. And, you know, there's possibly some implications for our genetics that are really well adapted to that rugged environment. They're suddenly sitting at home on the couch, basically, right? So, and then in the summer, we had these sort of foothills ranches that were sort of stopover places. We'd be there 2 weeks and then we move up to the summer. Well, they're getting a lot more grazing. They're getting more intensive use. We need them because we don't have anywhere else to go. In a cool season grass system, the grass senesces and you got to move on. It's not the most optimal forage. So, thoughts about this?
Why was there the change?
The change was basically to remove our threat to wildlife. So it was concern for bighorn winter range in the desert, and it was concern for grizzlies and wolf conservation in the high elevation pastures.
Is it a permanent change or is it just a temporary change?
This one, we voluntarily gave up those grazing permits, so we'd have to go through a process to get those back. The high elevation pastures we kind of phrase it as a study, and so it's not permanent, but we would have to have a lot of folks agree that sheep are a good use of that landscape, and currently they don't all agree on that. Just like the rest of the agriculture industry, the sheep at the station have faced a lot of scrutiny in terms of their impacts to wildlife. Yeah.
Have you seen a lot of ecological change in the vegetation since they stopped doing, like, has there been a lot of documented change on that? Or?
We're monitoring it now. Yeah, I would be surprised that it's huge in terms of, I'm sure that cover has gone up. We've seen a lot of shrub encroachment. I don't know if that's because of grazing or not. We've seen a lot of forest health issues, but that's kind of region-wide. So we've definitely removed the sheep which sort of, deals with the wildlife conflict, but in terms of vegetation, it was grazed so lightly that I'm not sure we're going to see a major boom. If we'd grazed as heavy as we could have, or we did in the early years, we probably would see a bigger impact. Yeah, I don't know that like the amount of grazing was the initial challenge. It was the interface between the two, if that makes sense. Yeah. Other thoughts?
How would you measure the change in nutrient cycling if there was one?
Yeah. We can do a couple of different things. We can monitor over time, before and after. If we don't have before and after, we can set up experiments that mimic the effect of removing or adding grazing at a smaller scale to get at that relationship and then sort of extrapolate to the landscape. So if for example, we do have some research on sheep bed grounds and impacts to sheep bed grounds and also stream crossings before they remove sheep, so we could do that after and compare, for example.
Are you measuring soil chemistry or?
Yeah, I am monitoring. I could talk about my monitor. We have some long-term plots from the 60s. They're measured in the 60s, 70s, and 90s. So I'm repeating that. So I don't have a right before and right after, but I will have soil carbon, and I'll have nutrients. So I can know the current status. Then I can go to ranches that still graze and compare, or I could set up an experiment to see the effects.
Do you use CO2 respiration too?
I don't. That's not within my methods, but some scientists do. And that's what I'm kind of going to talk about in a bit is I have kind of an open call to scientists. Scientists are kind of funny creatures for like a single, individual of a species. And so we have to find friends that do the thing if we don't know how to do it. So, yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah, Kelly.
So on the desert steppe and then the summer range that you're not using anymore, but are those BLM, both BLM?
These were BLM and Forest Service allotments, and just like a lot of other sheep ranchers. I actually have to find out if they're being grazed by cattle or if they're not being grazed at all. We do know that in central Idaho, like 20% of the allotments have closed, and it's like a reduction of 40 to 50%. I'll provide you the paper with the exact stat on like the reduction of AUMs in this region. So that's pretty similar to what other sheep producers have experienced with either with buyouts. There was a lot of work to remove sheep from the landscape. The summer range is actually ARS property, so it's ours.
So you're able to keep monitoring on the summer range?
Yeah, or I could monitor down here if I
You are
worked it out, but we don't actually have long-term monitoring down here.
You don't
We
know.
don't, no. So we'll have to use remote sensing to see what changed.
So you're not doing plant composition to see what.
Not yet, but do you want to come do it with me? I started up here, but I do want to work down into the desert. So what does a loss of mobility potentially mean for this system? Less flexibility and adaptive capacity for ranchers. We know wealthier ranchers weather drought better because they can move out of the drought, right? They have more land base. And so maybe the loss of mobility has something to do with our ability to move around and use pastoral knowledge to find the good forage, because rangeland systems are so dynamic. We can't irrigate, right? We just got to find the grass, find the forbs. Less mobility could mean loss of local knowledge, rural lifeways, changes in rural communities, and changes to production systems. Loss of mobility could mean system intensification. So maybe we choose an agriculture system that puts ag over here and wildlife over here instead of a working land system where they're interfacing more directly on shared landscapes. That creates new environmental and social challenges. And we're real careful in ag not to throw each other under the bus, but do you want to live next to, this kind of ag or that kind of ag, that sort of thing, right? And it means removing livestock from direct contact and risk for wildlife. So it's seen as a potential boon in many cases. Although in other cases, we know there's a lot of documentation about how we can use herbivores like sheep and cattle to shape habitat and improve biodiversity. So it depends on what system you're in. Okay. It also brings up sort of core questions for us as scientists and for managers. Like, what does the loss of mobility mean for the future of biodiversity? Are these interconnected agroecosystems part of interconnected wildlife corridors or not? What does it mean for carbon and nutrient cycling? David and I were talking about how little socks are just carbon sequestration, depending on how you look at it. Are we concentrating that? Is it more efficient in a transhuman system or in a confined setting? What does it mean for rural livelihoods and communities? What does it mean for land use, and what does it mean for food and health? How are we producing our food, and what is that animal eating? And this brings me to kind of this, this is like the fundamental hypothesis of range social science, which I call it the Brunson and Hunsinger hypothesis. It's, can old ranchers save the new West? And it posits, and it's certainly open for debate and contestation, that in systems like Beaverhead County, private ranchers with public land allotments are a core part of biodiversity conservation because they have an interconnectedness with the way land gets used. So if ranching economies go out of business, are private lands more likely to be developed for non-ag uses that then take it out of wildlife habitat, fragment the landscape, and ultimately change conservation outcomes. Now, there's many cases where this may be something we think is true, and there might be other cases where that doesn't play out at all, that actually maybe wealthy landowners come in and they don't subdivide it, but it's still available for wildlife habitat. So there's many different iterations for it, but this is kind of the working hypothesis, that these private lands, which actually tend to have a lot of the water and a lot of the more diverse areas, are economically dependent on the public lands. If they lose that, they're more likely to go out of business and develop that land. So there's a feedback loop there. So this brings me to my lab. I'll go through this really quick. How do we think about doing science in this kind of a setting? Do we think about, what is my job? Is it to write down the eulogy for the range sheep system and to understand it? Is my job to fight for range sheep production? Is my job to fight for wildlife? I have thought about this for a long time. And what I decided to do was just get folks together around the campfire. And I thought, boy, these folks that know the land really well, and I bet they'll come together and start talking to one another, and they might give me some good research questions, and maybe we can think together about it. So I'm launching the Collaboratory, and you're certainly invited to email me if you're interested in participating or being part of it. And it's been an iterative process. I've had a lot of Zoom chats and a lot of tours. We did some drinking of whiskey with the folks there, unnamed, we got out at Eastside Host, there was some whiskey, and we really started to get down to the nitty gritty. What do you care about? What do you want? What does this landscape mean to you? What do we not know? What are we worried about? And when we do that, we start to see that our goals are not that different. So if we lose these landscapes and we lose these communities, we're going to be in a totally different landscape that we don't want to be in. So how do we work with that in the science space? Because remember, I got to publish on this, and we drank whiskey, and it was all good and happy. It's not a scientific finding. Okay, so here's some methods. We're going to borrow a research design from Colorado from a project called the Collaborative Adaptive Rangeland Management Project. And what that project is, if you Google it, it's an ARS research station just like mine, but on much shorter grass. And to be honest, it's not as pretty there, but don't tell them that. It's the Great Plains, where they gave half of their station to a group of people who normally would be suing each other. And they said, here are your cows and your 10 pastures and your nerd troop, and we will measure whatever you want. Manage for birds, manage for beef, manage for drought. And they've been at it for about a decade. They lost a bunch of money right at first, because guess what? Rotating your cattle produces less average daily gains when you bunch them up in a tight group. So they're learning about all these economic outcomes. But it's a fun group. There's a fun Adobe interactive thing you can play with to learn about the process. And in that project, they're taking rancher knowledge and agency knowledge really seriously. In fact, my job in the project when I was there as a student was to hold the ecologists against the wall and tell them to be quiet, because the ranchers know a lot and the NRCS folks know a lot, and we've got to listen to them because they're part of this project as co-researchers. And we've done a lot of work with local knowledge, and we're recognizing more and more that we can't solve these problems without valuing that and taking it very seriously. This is one of my favorite co-authors, Mr. Jim Sturrock, who's a rancher in eastern Colorado. And my advisor, Maria, and I, we use a lot of interviews. We use a lot of things like the ecological calendars to document that knowledge and incorporate it into our work. And what we found is that 80 years is as good as a p-value. P-value is a standard in statistics to understand your findings while validating local knowledge. If you've been out there for 80 years, you're not going to believe my 1-year bar graph data. Okay, like it's not going to happen. It's not positive science, and that's okay. It's contextual, it's practice and decision oriented, it's long term, it's aware of how knowledge gets used in the political sphere. It's aware of that. Scientists just think, oh, it's true. No, it's used in many different ways. It gets warped and twisted, right? So that local knowledge has a particular sort of meaning, and it differs by age, it differs by context. But it's really an important force in our rangeland management. We need to learn to work with it. And I've had a fun time working with it. For example, Jim and I went through all his red books. Those are those little things that ranchers keep in their pockets, and they write down, you know, everything that happened. Well, he threw 2013 over the ravine because it was stressful, but every other red book we went through, and we mapped out how he made decisions. How did he perceive the world around him? I don't know if this is true. I didn't double check it. That's not the point. It's to say, how did Jim operate when there were no monsoons, when there was a drought? He went and bought dairy cows and put his calves on a dairy cow and sold the mamas. 4 calves on a, you know, whatever he could do to save money. And he learned over time to be more humble and work with nature. And so we documented that, kind of told that story. And that's something we can take to the scientists and say, here's the whole story. Here's how this person that makes decisions works with it. Now, Extension knows this. NRCS knows this. Good Forest Service and BLM range cons know this. But those of us who make bar graphs for a living don't always know this. So it's integrating all those knowledges together, taking them seriously, and then working ethically with that. So I'll skip this slide, but there's a big ethical component to this, because I don't know how many ecologists have come to me and say, I'm going to work with ranchers. And I'm like, are you? Are you going to show up for them? Or are you going to take the data and leave? It's the same story in every community, right? So I kind of expect people to show back up and give something back. But we've got to learn to do this kind of work like they did in Colorado in systems where there's a lot of conflict. Colorado has prairie dog problems. Do not underestimate the conflict that prairie dogs can create. 80,000 acres of prairie dogs will create conflict. But they don't have the conflict that I have to deal with. So how do I think about different social science frameworks to engage in that kind of context? How do we work with we know fundamentally we're not going to agree 100%, right? Can we live with that? And there's a field called peace studies that's thought about this quite a bit. And Johan Goldhug has thought about this quite a bit. So we'll have a social and an ecological side. We're monitoring change in the landscape, but also working with people collaboratively to think together about how the station should sort of operate on the range science side. We'll convene baseline goal setting this winter and develop some protocols to implement some treatments based on what people want to know. I'll finish my survey in the centennials this summer, and then we'll apply some either adaptive management or some monitoring that sort of helps folks answer the questions that they have, hopefully building trust and respect as we go along. Now, it could fail completely, and that's totally part of science. So, what's the worst that could happen? So hit me up if you're interested in learning more. We're always around the station, love to do tours and to chat with people. Just need a little heads up if you're coming by. If you're a researcher or student, we'll have a range sheep session at SRM this year, which is in Boise. If you're a student and you haven't heard of the Society for Range Management, it's a cool meeting that happens every year somewhere in the West, and it's basically a social club with a science problem. It's a fun group of people. There's it's one of the only scientific societies where you'll see ranchers talking to conservation folks, talking to scientists. So really diverse, and we'll have a really cool session there on the role of sheep in the modern world. If you have any connection to production, I've got a way for you to engage, which is our photo voice survey. So I'm currently conducting a survey where I'm asking producers to send me 3 photos of what their world looks like and then to talk with me about what that means. So if you're interested in that, let me know. Do I have 5 minutes? Okay. So I want to hear what y'all have to say, and I want you to think with me about these problems. I recognize I'm very biased towards particular points of view in the system, and I'm trying to create a space where folks with completely different points of view have a lot to say about what I do, and that's a risky situation for me as a scientist, but I think it's kind of where we have to be, right? Who has read Ivan Doig? That's like way more than any other experience I've ever had. That's cool. So I always joke that I'm living Ivan Doig's life backwards. He grew up the son of sheep herders, and there's a part in one of his memoirs where he realized he was not coming back, and because it's brutal, right? It can be kind of a brutal experience, particularly in that time. He grew up in the 40s. So I just wanted to share his kind of look at local knowledge and to think with you about sort of what the future of these sorts of systems might mean for those of us working in them. And this is from Ride With Me, Mariah, Montana. It's fiction, but it's certainly based on probably a lot of experience. And it's a rancher is out looking for his herder and looking for his sheep and reflecting on his life. He said, and that's Ivan Doig with his sheep herder parents. There's a great Doig collection at the MSU Library if you're interested. He said, on impulse, I drove to the brow of the slope above the buildings instead of back down to the creek road immediately. As a rancher trying to make a living from this country, I subscribe to the reminder that view is particularly hard to get a fork into. Yet I somehow didn't want to pass up this divide line chance to sightsee. Onward east from where I was parked on Breed Butte now, a kind of veranda of land runs parallel between English Creek and Noon Creek, a low, square-edged plateau keeping their river valleys apart until they at last flow into Two Medicine River. In boyhood Julys, I rode horseback across the benchland at dawn to help with the haying on Noon Creek. When the sun rose out of the sweetgrass hills and caught my horse and me, our combined shadow shot a couple of 100 feet across the grassland, a stretched version of us, as if the earth and life had instantly, wildly expanded. But for once, my main attention was ahead instead of back, between the benchlands of the Blackfeet Reservation in the distance, and my vantage point there on Breed Butte to the broad valley of Noon Creek could be seen, with Willowed Stream winding through hay meadows and past swales of pasture, a majority of the double W's holdings. Of that entire north face of the Two Medicine Country, I was zeroed in on the corner of land directly below towards the mountains, my ranch. The old Reese house that was now the cookhouse. The new house, all possible windows to the west and the mountains that Marcella and I had built. The line of Lombardy poplars marking our driveway in from Noon Creek Road. The lambing shed, even the upstream bend of hayfield where Kenny and Darlene were baling. Every bit of it could be enumerated from here. Enumerating is one thing, and making it all add up is a hell of another. Oh, I had tried. I'd even had the ranch put through a computer earlier this year. A Bozeman outfit in the land analysis business programmed it all for me, and what printed out was that no, the place couldn't be converted into a dude ranch because with the existing Shoto duty colonies in one direction and Glacier National Park in another, Noon Creek was not destination specific enough to compete. That maybe a little money could be made by selling hay from the ranch's irrigated meadows if the drought cycle continued and if I wanted to try to live on other people's misfortune. That yes, when you come right down to it, this land and locale were best fitted to support animal units, economic lingo for cattle or the band of sheep I already had on the place, wherever the hell they were at the moment. In short, the wisdom of the microchips amounted to pretty much the local knowledge I already possessed. That to make a go of the ranch, you had to hard learn its daily elements. Pace your body through one piece of work after another, paying heed always to the living components, the sheep, the grass, the hay. But the gravitational wear and tear on fences and sheds and roads and equipment also somehow attended to, so that you're able to reliably tell yourself at nightfall, that was as much of a day as I can do. Then get up and do it all again, 364 tomorrows in a row. Sitting there seeing the ranch in its every detail, knowing every ounce of work it required. Jesus, but how I right then wished for 15 years off my age. I did settle for 5, yet truth knows every way to nag. Even if I had seen that many fewer calendars, would it do any good in terms of the ranch ultimately? Maybe people from now on are going to exist on bean sprouts and wear polyester all over themselves, and lamb and wool belong behind glass in a museum. Maybe what I have known how to do in my life, which is ranching, simply does not register anymore. You can contact me here. If you hated it, you can call my boss. But I'd love to hear your thoughts or questions.
Thank you. I mean, I really just wanted to say thanks for that. I think it's hard to have one foot on either side of the fence.